Well, as Nathan said, we want to welcome all of you. It's so good to see you here this morning, especially our visitors, and we have a number of visitors. If it seems like Bill is on his really good behavior, it's because not only is Lenore here, but his sister is here. And all those shocking stories we expect, they're all true. So we have Lance's parents here, and we want to welcome them. And we also want to pray for Lance's daughters. They're under the weather, not with us, and Ashley's back with them back home. So let's keep them in our prayers as well. And so good to have Mark Legs. I think his parents are here, and all of you that are visiting. I can't name you all, but thank you so much for being here. And we have a number that are watching on live stream. Some of you in hospital rooms. We want to say welcome to the Anthonys, and let Sarah know we are really, really praying for you, just that you will get well, be home soon. Also, Daniel and Mike and Paula. And Daniel, just in our prayers all the time. We want you to know that. And all of you that are joining us from home, we want to welcome you. Now, before you go up to Aaron and you have great disdain, you kick him in the shin, he is not here with another woman. This is his wife. She's told me this is the way she usually looks. This is her normal look, but we haven't seen that for a while, so just want to let you know. That's not another woman. So this morning, I want to do a lesson entitled A Father to a Son. I think most of you know that Tamrai next week or this week will be traveling up to Cincinnati, where our second child, our youngest son, will be getting married. He's the first of our three children to take this step. So this is all new to us. And Friday, I'll be standing before family and friends and joining Travis and Hannah in holy matrimony. So there's no doubt that weddings and marriage, relationship of a father to a son has been on my mind. And I just wanted to keep it there in this sermon. And just share some things with you, some reminders, some things that a father would want to say to a son before he gets married and even continually after he gets married. And so I've been thinking a lot about 31 years ago, where I was the groom and Tamara was the bride, and thinking about that day and about us joining our lives together. And during that time, Tamara's parents gave me this book that you see up here. It's a book that has a companion for brides called Letters to Karen. This one is called Letters to Philip. And it's a book about a father writing to his son, Philip, about how to treat a woman. A son about ready to get married. And with that kind of theme, I wanted to talk about not everything we could talk to a son before he gets married, but a few things that I've talked to Travis about, both over the years and even more importantly, recently in preparation for this big day. So I'm going to go over 3 things that I've talked to Travis about a father would want to say to his son. And I'm also going to just kind of reminisce a little bit. I've got some pictures of Travis as he's growing up here. And I'm going to try, I think I can get through it Friday. I told Nathan I'm going to try to stay in preacher mode and not get into father mode. And if I can stay in preacher mode, I think I'll do it. I think I could get through today's lesson as well. But one of the things I would want to tell Travis, and that I've talked about to Travis, is how to become one flesh. That's a difficult concept to kind of what does that mean? How do two people become one flesh? And of course, this goes back to the very beginning where God created marriage, where he looked at man and he says it's not good for man to be alone. And so he says, I will make him a helper. The King James Version, a helpmeet, right? Someone that's going to help him, that's going to be a companion for him. And so God took from the man a rib. And women's creation is this special creation. No other creature is created like the woman. And so out of this rib that came from the man, he forms the woman, brings her to the man, and Adam is excited. It is love at first sight. And the last thing that he names is woman, with that very title. He calls her woman, for she was taken from man. She is of the man. And so, with all of that happening, amazingly, God creates marriage in one sentence. For this cause, he says, for everything that we just looked at, for this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. But how do two people, different, distinct from one another, with different backgrounds and different likes and dislikes, right? We talk about opposites attract. How do two become one flesh? What does that mean? Well, you hear sometimes people in relationships say something like this, well, don't try to change me. You can't change me. You need to accept me as I am. Well, when it comes to getting married, there is some truth to that. But there's also some untruth to that. And that's kind of what this idea of one flesh is about. There are some things that before you get married and even after you get married, some things that need to change. Some things that need to be removed. And some things that don't need to be part of who you are anymore. But it's definitely true that the person that you fell in love with and what they are, their character and the personality, you should want that to be part of the marriage. But here's the question, how do we figure out what that is? How do we figure out when something doesn't need to enter into the marriage or when something needs to be removed? Well, first let me talk about a few things as we answer this question, how do two become one? Let's talk about a few things about how some people have gone about to try to come this idea of two becoming one. How do you become one flesh? Well, falsely, some have thought this way. Well, we become exactly alike. Well, that's impossible. There's no way you can become exactly alike. And not only that, but God never intended for a husband and wife to become completely alike. That's not the idea. You should, and God wants you to bring both the husband and wife, who they are, to that marriage. What you are is special to God, and it should be special to your spouse. All right, so some say, okay, well, not that, then, well, you become like me. That's how we become one flesh. You become like me. And I want to tell you, this is probably one of the more common ways of people trying to become one flesh. And the way that it comes out is that you have basically one of the partners there becomes the dominant partner. And the other one becomes the silent partner. And he's like, okay, you become like me. And so the dominant one's very happy because they're, right? You have to do what I like and you have to dislike what I dislike. And the silent partner just kind of goes along with, well, that's not what God intended, and that doesn't work. Well, some will say this, okay, well, then let's have a 50-50 marriage, right? I'm going to bring half of me into the marriage, and you bring half of you, and then we'll be one, right? We'll be 100%. Well, again, that's impossible, isn't it? And then how do you figure out which 50% of yourself that you bring in? And how do you keep that 50%? So these are some ways that people have tried to answer this question. How do two become one? But none of these are what God expected, what God desired. So I'd like to show you this chart. This is a chart that I come up with that I think explains it pretty well. A couple of things I would want to say to Travis about this. Number one, you'll notice in this we have marriage. And marriage has some important parts to it. You've got the husband and you've got the wife. But you also have a third component, and that is the relationship. And that's how we answer this question. But before we get into that, there's a fourth component, which is really the first component, that if you want your marriage to be one flesh, and you want to have that until death do you part, you want to have that endurance, you need to have, of course we know this, you need to have God. And God needs to be right there in the middle. God needs to be in the middle. He needs to be first. So I would want Travis to know, and Travis knows this, that if he wants his marriage to be as strong as possible, then his relationship with God has to be as strong as possible, and it has to be first. And Hannah knows that if she wants her marriage to be as strong as possible, that her relationship with God has to be as strong as possible, and it has to be first. And isn't that interesting? You put God first, and your marriage actually doesn't suffer. It actually becomes stronger. But let's talk a little bit about the relationship. That's the one flesh relationship. That's what you have vowed to in the covenant that you make. And so what you want that one flesh relationship to be as strong as possible. So if you're going to bring something into that marriage, or you're going to add something to that relationship that's going to put stress on it, that's going to cost love out of the love bank of your marriage, if you're going to put something that's going to jeopardize that relationship, then that's something you need to remove. That's what it means to be one flesh. But oftentimes you'll hear, a partner say, well, I want it. What about me? Well, what about you? It's not about you. You're in this relationship. And that's the focus. If it's something that you bring to the marriage, if it's something that you add to the relationship, and it doesn't hinder it, it doesn't put any stress to it, it doesn't have any jeopardy, as Jesus said, what God has joined together, let no man separate. If there's no possibility of that, in fact, maybe even it makes it a little bit stronger, then yeah, it can be added. Be part of that. And that's what it means to be one flesh. Two becoming one is that focus of that relationship. And throughout your marriage, as you change and as you grow, as I've told Travis and Hannah, you're going to change, you're going to grow. What you want to do in life is going to change. And what you think is important in life is going to change. How do you change together? You focus on that relationship with God in the middle. And what you're going to find is you're going to find that those decisions, what do we sacrifice? There's going to be things you have to sacrifice, but there's also things you can add, things that you can grow in, things that you desire and you can have. It's kind of that give and take of the marriage relationship. And so from a father to a son, that's what I would want him to know. And those are the things we've talked about over the years and recently. I'd also, from a father to son, want him to know something that took me a long time to learn, and I'm still learning it. And that is how to treat a woman. And that's really what this book is all about, the idea of how does a man treat a woman? How does a husband treat his wife? So important. This is actually a picture of Travis's baptism in 2012. He was 13 years old. Finally wore us down. Kept asking and asking. We kept studying. And I just knew one day when he asked, I saw it in his eyes. And so, just as it is an honor to be able to unite him and Hannah in marriage, it was a great honor, and it's always been a great honor to baptize all three of my kids into Christ. The most important decision that they ever made. And so here's that picture, and you can see how young he was, but he's remained faithful to that vow that he made. And I know he will remain faithful to the vow that he makes on Friday. But I want him to know how to treat a woman. And there's a lot of passages we could look at, but I want to look at Ephesians chapter 5. This is a passage that Travis and I have looked at. Travis, Hannah, and I have looked at. And it's a passage I want to talk about because it's a passage so misunderstood by the world. And so what Christian father wouldn't want their Christian children to know the true reality of what Jesus created between a man and a woman, between a husband and wife? Oftentimes the world starts in verse 22, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife," and that's where they stop. And we know the picture that they paint, that God's way of making the man as the head and the wife to be submissive allows the man to be that dominant one and the woman to be this inferior slave, and the man just gets to do whatever he wants. And my answer to that picture is keep reading. Keep reading. There is nothing in what God created, there's nothing in what Paul talks about in inspiration that would allow such a thing. Verse 25. "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her." God instructs a husband to love his wife. And what is amazing to me is that this is written to people who lived in a culture whose marriages were arranged by their families. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have a say in it, but what that means is they didn't do what we do. They didn't find a common attraction, and then start dating to see if they were compatible and to develop that relationship and then decide, okay, let's get married. They didn't do that. And yet, God, our Creator, says what? To love your wives. And if they could do it in that culture, in that situation, how much more should we be not only able to do it, but wanting to do it when we get to choose our companion and to choose our wedding day, the one that we're going to marry? But I want you to notice he says, "Husbands, love your wives," but he doesn't stop there. What does he do? He defines that love as Christ loved his bride, as Christ loved the church. And how did he love? Well, what he focuses on is a love that sacrifices. As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I want my son to know that that's the kind of love he needs to have for his wife. That's the kind of love that God expects him to have, a sacrificial love. And I know our common idea of all of that is kind of that macho man, yes, I will take a bullet for my wife. And yes, that is included, that you be willing to take your life for hers. But it goes beyond that. You're going to have to sacrifice time and energy and desire sometimes. Why? Because of that one flesh relationship. Because you're trying to build that up and strong and support one another. But here's the neat thing, is that when you do that, and the more that you do it, the more your wife is motivated to do it for you as well. But then he also goes on to say, not only love your wives, but he says of Jesus In verse 26, that he gave himself up for her so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all of her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. He talks about the way Christ wants to present his bride. Holy and blameless, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing. I tell you, if there was a bride that Jesus could just emphasize all the weakness and all the sin, it would be the church. We talk so much about the church, right? The church is imperfect. Why? Because it's made up of us. It's made up of human beings, and we're imperfect, and we're sinful, and we're weak, right? But that's not what Jesus did to his bride. He gave himself up for her that he may present his bride holy and blameless. He doesn't want to present the weakness. He wants to present her with no spot, no wrinkle. And I want my son to have that same desire. That he would present his bride to the world, and he would talk about his wife to the world in such a way that the world would see all that makes her beautiful, all that was the initial attraction that continued to be the attraction. But unfortunately, there's a lot of husbands out there that want to complain, want everyone to know the weaknesses of their wives, all the things that they do wrong. And I want to say, even if we do it jokingly, over and over, and at some point the joke doesn't become funny. And it's not the way Christ loved his bride. I'd want my son to have that as a goal. And like I've said, I've had to learn these lessons, and I continue to learn them in my marriage. I want you to notice what he writes in verse 28. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. I want you to notice those words. Nourish. He is to nourish her, cherish her, like he would his own flesh. Where in any of this, brothers of Christ, is this picture that a man can treat his wife like a slave? That he can just dominate her, that she just has to roll over. No, it is quite the opposite that he is picturing for us husbands. That we are to put her up on a pedestal. That we are to treat her as precious. The world doesn't understand that. But a father to a son, he definitely would want him to understand such a lesson. He finishes off the thought in verse 33. That we are each individual among you, what? Love his own wife, even as himself. It's that old saying, if mama's not happy, no one's happy, right? Happy wife, happy life. And I want my son to know this as well. How important it is to communicate. This is a picture of Travis graduating from Florida College. We're getting pretty close to today's time. Both Tamara and I are very proud of him, the man he's become. But as he enters this new relationship, this new stage in life, I'd want him to know and remember how to communicate with that wife, with Hannah. You know, there are marriages that struggle with this. They struggle to communicate. And sometimes we might think that a couple that's not communicating, that's a problem. But most of the time, a lack of communication in marriage is a symptom of a bigger problem. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. But there are times that I've found in my own marriage, in my own experiences, that couples are trying to communicate. They may even be trying to communicate love, but they're missing it. They're not doing it. It's just missing the mark. And I find that so interesting where you have the best of intention, you're trying to communicate with your spouse, you're trying to show them, I care about you, I love you, but you're just kind of missing each other. And why is that? Well, I want to bring a couple passages up here. The first one is Genesis chapter 2, verse 14. This goes a little bit before God actually institutes the marriage. We talked about this before, Genesis 2:24. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. That word helper is right there. I love that word. He created a helper for him, a helper that is suitable. I like to put it this way, a helper that is the perfect helper for the husband. I want to combine that with this passage as well in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. You husbands likewise live with your wives in an understanding way as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. Again, I would ask that question. The world's picture, where is it? He says what? Grant her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. And when he says that she's a woman, she's the weaker vessel, he's not saying that in a derogatory way. He is saying she is the precious china that you put in the china cabinet and you lock up for its own protection. Sometimes the most valuable things that we have are the most fragile things. And it's the fragileness of it that adds to the preciousness of it. That's what he's talking about. But I want to focus, as I highlighted here, where he talks about husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, New American Standard. We all know the common joke of that, right? Hey, he says we have to live with them in an understanding way. He doesn't say we have to understand them. Well, it's kind of funny because there's some truth to that, right? There's some truth to that sometimes it's hard to understand them. Maybe it's even impossible because men and women are different. But it all goes back to that Genesis chapter 2:14. What was the goal? To create a companion that would be a helper. Well, a man doesn't need a companion that's just like him, right? We talked about that in the one flesh, the one flesh relationship. You don't become alike. No, a man needs someone that is strong in what he's weak in. A man needs someone that what? Is weak where he's strong. And they can help one another in that way. It's a perfect plan of God, but we have to recognize it does come with some challenges. We've got to remember that we are different. It's true in communication. Men and women communicate differently. And not only that, men and women fulfill different needs when it comes to communication. Let me give you some examples of these differences. Women can talk about several subjects all at the same time and keep it straight. Tamara and I have a term for that. It's called gapping. And we'll be talking, and we've learned to use this term. It's kind of code word, right? And she'll bring up some other person that we hadn't been talking about, and I'm going, wait, what? Huh? What? And I'll ask her, I'll say, did you just gap? And that's code word for her to, oh, wait, I'm not talking to a woman. Back up. Tell me who you're talking about. And so we've developed that as a way to kind of like, hey, we're not communicating very well here, right? Men and women communicate differently. Men communicate linear, right? And just the facts, man. Just give me the facts. That's all I need, right? Women communicate different. In fact, this is true. A woman can go into a public restroom and come out having made a friend in the restroom. Yeah, women can do that, right? Men, we don't do that. We know you go in there, eyes straight ahead, you do your business, you don't say a word, you get out, right? That's the way we communicate. It's different. I'm trying to remember the name of this game. Ever play that game where you get a word on a card and you have to draw that word, and then your team has to guess that word? What is that called? Pictionary, yes. You ever played that where you have a team of all men and a team of all women? Men, forget about it. You just can't win when it's like that. I've seen a time, it's the women's turn, where she'll draw a squiggly line that goes up like that. In 2 seconds, more than one of the women are like, Florida. That's it. And the men are going, what? That's Florida? How'd you get that? It happens. Squiggly line, they got it. Men and women communicate differently. So what I want my son to know is that sometimes we start missing each other. Sometimes we gap. Sometimes we're trying to communicate, but we're missing each other, right? And sometimes you got to just stop and say, okay, how can I say this more like a woman would say it? How can I communicate to her in woman language, right? Now, that doesn't come natural for us. It takes some work. It takes some recognition. But if we can do that, we'll find ourselves fighting a lot less and communicating a lot better. There's a lot that, from a father to a son, we've talked about. There's a lot that even after his marriage, we'll probably talk about. But that day is coming, and this is a picture of both Travis and Hannah. This is where he proposed to her, and you can see the emotion of that. And I'm sure Friday's going to be a wonderful day, but it's going to be an emotional day. If you're a parent that's already gone through this, if you have any advice, let me know. I'd appreciate it. I'm going to try to stay, for the most part, in preacher mode until it's all over, and then I can get into father mode. Maybe there's one here this morning, because there's another marriage the Bible talks about, and that's an eternal marriage. That's where, as we talked about in Ephesians chapter 5, Christ comes for his bride and takes her into that marriage feast for eternity. Right now, we are betrothed to Christ. We're not married to him yet, but we know betrothal is just almost like a marriage. But maybe there's one here this morning that needs to come and be ready for that wedding day. Maybe you need to confess what you believe in Jesus Christ and to repent of your sins and to be baptized for the remission of those sins. Or maybe your relationship with Jesus hasn't been submissive. Maybe it hasn't been completely dedicated to him. If we can help you, pray with you, encourage you, whatever we can do, because there is a great marriage feast coming, and we want you to be ready. If we can do that, why don't you let that be known as together we stand and as we sing.